All right. Well, thank you for coming today. Really appreciate it. It's a kind of a Kansas theme, but I feel like the first couple sessions I had to thank people for coming because the weather was so bad. And now I have to thank you for coming because it's such a nice day. So I really appreciate everybody being here and making time in their afternoon to talk to Mike and I. So this is our fifth of 7 discussion groups on the topic of international trade in the 21st century. And I'm really excited today. We've got Mike Matson, who is the Director of Industry Affairs and Development with the Kansas Farm Bureau. A couple updates on the trade front. So it's just kind of another sleepy Wednesday. So the president is in Ohio today. He's embroiled in a fight with General Motors and the United Auto Workers over the closing of a GM plant in Lordstown, Ohio. The president's tariffs on steel and aluminum have cost General Motors and Ford $1 billion each, and were one of the reasons given by General Motors' CEO in November when she announced that they would be cutting 14,000 jobs, including closing that plant in Ohio. We also learned today that in mid-February, the Department of Commerce submitted a report to the president that provided him with a national security rationale to impose new tariffs of up to 25% on foreign cars. So you'll remember that both Ottman and Arun talked about this. This is the same rationale that the president has previously used to apply tariffs on aluminum and steel. At this point, we don't know how the Department of Commerce justified its finding that imported cars pose a threat to national security, but we shouldn't feel bad because the U.S. Senate doesn't know why the department made that decision either. They also don't know what's in the report. The potential tariffs are opposed by the auto industry, by our allies, by congressional Republicans. They're the source of bitter fighting between the president's senior advisors and also between the White House and a number of Republican senators. In other news, the U.S. Trade Representative and the Secretary of the Treasury are headed to China next week to continue bilateral trade talks. So, in other words, not much is happening in the trade space. So as I was doing some research for this week's session, I came across a statement in an article from Politico that I thought really concisely summarized a lot of the concepts that we've talked about thus far in this session and kind of cut across a number of different discussions that we've had. What the article said is that Trump's simple formula of demanding that specific plants should stay open doesn't account for the sophistication of the global auto industry. The automaking supply chain is global. Foreign companies build cars in the U.S., but with some foreign-made parts. Likewise, cars made abroad often contain American parts. And automakers move workers from plant to plant as demand for different kinds of autos shifts. And what I really want to emphasize in today's session is how trade is not really just this obscure, faraway issue that's being debated in Washington, D.C. It has a huge role on our collective well-being and prosperity here in Kansas. And here's what I mean. In 2017, Kansas exported $1.25 billion in goods and services. Right here in Lawrence, companies exported $72 million in goods and services. In manufacturing alone, as of 2016, over 43,000 Kansas manufacturing jobs were supported by exports. 3,263 Kansas companies exported in 2015, and of those, 82%, 2,682, were small and medium-sized businesses, and those accounted for 22% of total exports from Kansas. In 2015, foreign-owned companies employed 57,600 Kansas workers, which means that 5% of Kansans who are working somewhere in the private sector are working at a foreign-owned company. The Brookings Institution, a nonprofit public policy organization, found that no American city was more impacted by the tariffs with China than Wichita because of the number of Wichita jobs related to either aviation or agriculture. That's fascinating, out of all the cities in the U.S. And so what are we exporting here in Kansas? So here are the top export categories in 2017. Number 1 is transportation equipment, driven by our aerospace industry, just under $3 billion. Number 2 is processed foods, $2.25 billion. Number 3, agricultural products, $1.58 billion. Number 4, machinery, almost $1 billion. And number 5, chemicals, $885 million. Who are we exporting to? So our largest 5 export markets in 2017 were Canada, $2.5 billion, Mexico, $1.9 billion, so our neighbors to the north and south and our NAFTA partners, Japan, $981 million, China, $703 million, and Germany, $431 million. And because we've talked about this issue of bilateral trade deficits in both our sessions with Arun, with Ottman, with Scott Handler, I wanted to point out that Kansas actually has a positive trade balance. We export about $454 million more in goods and services than we import. Quick reminder, we've got 2 more discussion groups after today. Next week, we'll talk to Megan Grube, who was the former director of speechwriting at the U.S. Department of Commerce. She's going to talk about crafting the Obama administration's messaging on trade and how these different narratives about trade are shaping public opinion. We'll conclude our discussion group on April 3rd by looking at how trade agreements, once enacted, are enforced. Now I want to introduce Mike and get right to our conversation. I want to leave plenty of time for your questions, of course. So Mike was a political reporter for WIBW for 4 years before moving to the other side of the camera, becoming communications director for Governor Bill Graves. In 2000, Mike joined the Kansas Farm Bureau as its director of communications and public relations, a position he held for over 12 years. In 2012, Mike joined the Kansas Leadership Center as vice president of innovative and strategic communications. In 2016, Mike rejoined the Kansas Farm Bureau as its Director of Industry Affairs and Development. Mike writes a column every other Sunday in the Manhattan Mercury, and in 2017 released a book, Spifflicated, detailing his family's struggles with addiction. Please join me in welcoming Mike to the Dole Institute.
Thank you.
So, Mike, you've had such an interesting career, first as a political reporter, communications director for the governor, then in senior leadership and communications roles for the Kansas Farm Bureau and the Kansas Leadership Center. Before rejoining the Farm Bureau, you studied broadcasting and journalism in college. What sparked your interest in journalism?
You know, I think I trace it back to high school. And in high school, I went to high school in Wichita Heights. I actually went to high school with Darnell Valentine, who's a University of Kansas alum, right? At Heights, Darnell was a better basketball player than I was.
But you might have been a better journalist.
I was a better yearbook photographer than he was, right? So
that's not nothing.
I trace it back to yearbook class. High school yearbook class is what sparked my interest in journalism. And this is the late 70s, right? And so this is pre-internet. This is pre a lot of the technology that exists today with respect to how journalism is delivered. And back then, it was a yearbook was one book that is to chronicle an entire school year. Right, and so you don't have a deadline the way you do in a daily newspaper sort of setup. And so it was in that class, and we'd had a brand new teacher, a brand new advisor who was fresh out of the Navy and wanted to teach, but we were his first class. And so we were all kind of learning together this notion of journalism and what it means to tell a story and how you can communicate a story through photographs, through words, and everything that goes into a yearbook class. And that just kind of stuck with me.
You also obviously had an intense interest in politics and public affairs. What drew you to those subjects?
Well, I was thinking about that, and I think you have to trace that one back even further. My father was a farmer. My dad went to K-State, got a degree in agronomy, and like a lot of people of his generation, after college, he went back to the family farm, and we farmed for a while in Rooks County, north of Hayes. And Dad would tell the story of one day I was sitting on the tractor and I heard a voice tell me it's time to do something else, right? And I told that story once to some old boys in Farm Bureau, and they said, a lot of us hear that voice, but not too many of us listen. For whatever reason, this was in the 60s. My father listened, and he sold the farm. He and Mom had the difficult conversation, sold the farm. That financed a graduate degree at Fort Hays in education, and Dad became a school teacher. And so this is 1967, and so he was teaching for a year. We'd moved to Wichita, because that's where he'd got a job, and he was teaching physics and geology, and he had an opportunity for a summer fellowship at the University of California. And so we moved, our family from Kansas, right, moved to Berkeley, California in the summer of 1968, right? So farm kid, I was 9 years old, farm kid who has just recently moved to the big city of Wichita, plopped down in Berkeley, California in the summer of 68. And you know what was happening in Berkeley in the summer of 68. It was the epicenter of counterculture. There were, Bobby Kennedy had just been assassinated about a week or two after we got to Berkeley. King had been assassinated just a couple of months before that. That was the year the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. And so all of this stuff was happening around me as a 9-year-old. And my father had an intense interest in all of this stuff, which is, I think, in hindsight, one of the reasons that we went to Berkeley that summer. And so as a 9-year-old kid, I started paying attention to some of this stuff, right? And my dad, there was a newspaper, a counterculture newspaper called the Berkeley Barb, which my father would bring home, right? Here we are from Wichita, Kansas, and Dad's bringing home the Berkeley Barb, and I would read it, and there was all kinds of counterculture stuff in there. And he also brought home U.S. News and World Report, right? And so I would read that and devour that as a 9-year-old. And then when we got back to Kansas, that stuff just stuck with me, right? I had this interest that I think was sparked in Berkeley of how things get done in the public sphere, right? And what it takes to move an agenda, and how you can be effective with certain ways of communicating, and how ideas stick. And that just kind of stuck with me. So I think that's, when I trace my interest in politics and in public policy, I got to go back to summer of 68 in Berkeley.
Wow. Well, now you had, I think, an interesting Bob Dole story to share, and I think it was from your time as a
Yes.
political journalist.
When I was covering politics and government for WIBW TV in Topeka, 90 to 94. And this was when Dole was Senate Majority Leader. He had already run for president twice, and he'd run for vice president once, and he was ready to run for re-election in 1992 to the U.S. Senate in Kansas. And it was sort of a foregone conclusion that Senator Dole was going to win re-election, right? There was no Democrat that was strong enough to put up a fight against him. But still, as a political reporter, as an objective, unbiased journalist, my goal was to tell the story. And so we were trying to figure out what's the story that you can tell about Bob Dole in 1992 in Kansas. And so we started paying attention to the news releases he would send. And as the election got closer, about twice a week, he'd send back news releases announcing a new senior center in Atchison, or new federal spending going on for a new interchange in Johnson County. And I started collecting these, right? So all of a sudden, the thing that hit my mind was, all right, we're getting closer to an election. He's bringing federal money back to Washington. Even though his reelection is assured, there might be a story here. And so my thought was, let's collect enough of these news releases so that we have a list of these projects, and let's make a story out of that. And so we were looking for one that was visual, since we were television, and we were looking for one in Topeka, and sure enough, one crosses the fax machine. That's where technology was at the time. New helicopters for the Kansas Air National Guard at Forbes Field in Topeka. So we go out to Forbes Field, we get pictures of the helicopters, and we interview the National Guard spokesperson, who's thrilled that the new equipment is here and says all the right things. And we interview a Dole spokesman who says all the right things. But the thing that hit the air that night, we took photographs of the rotors of the helicopters, right? And the tease to the story in the 6 o'clock news was a picture of those helicopter rotors with the words, "Pork choppers?" ? Because it was pork coming back, right? And I had nothing to do with that, but then that's what the editors had put on television. So the next week, Dole comes back to Topeka for a news conference, and we're all gathered there ready to ask questions, and he's a pretty intimidating guy, right? If you've never met him, in his prime, Bob Dole was a pretty intimidating guy. And I didn't think anything about the news story. You know, I didn't think, he probably hadn't even seen it. And so I'm gathered with a collection of reporters, and we're all set up with TVs, cameras, and microphones, and we're ready to ask him a question. And Dole, of course, he would hold a pen in his right hand,
Right.
and he came up and he saw me sitting on the front row, and he points at me in front of everyone. He goes, "Yeah, Matson, pork choppers. That's pretty funny." And I wanted to dig a hole and crawl in it at that point. But they just gave me, it was like, here we were trying to do this expose on pork coming back to Kansas, and voters should think twice about voting for Dole as a result, and it didn't even register with him.
And so in an era when you didn't routinely just go from hosting Fox and Friends to being a senior White House official, you made this jump to going on the other side of the lens. And what was that like going from a political reporter covering the governor's office to being in the governor's administration as his director of communications?
Yeah, it was literally going from a position of unbiased objectivity, trying to tell a story through the camera lens of journalism one day, to the next day you are promoting a political and policy agenda, right? And so that it was a bit of a transition. And I joined when Graves was still a candidate for governor. So we were in campaign mode before he was elected. And I had always had an interest in working in a political campaign. I had had some opportunities before that came along, but with Graves, it was one of those things where I admired him as Secretary of State. That was the position he had held. I knew him personally from covering him in that office, and I liked what he stood for. I liked the demeanor that he put forth. He would often say, "I'm willing to sit down and talk to anyone who's willing to sit down and talk to me," and that approach is now, in hindsight, it's somewhat refreshing, right? We don't see much of that today, but it was a transition going from capital J journalist to full-blown political operative, literally overnight.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Kansas Farm Bureau is in its 100th year, which is an amazing accomplishment for the organization, and obviously a lot has changed both in Kansas and in agriculture in the past 100 years. What do you see as the role of the Farm Bureau in today's Kansas, and how does the organization strive to best serve its members?
We are at our origin a trade group. We're an advocacy organization for family farmers and ranchers. And so I often tell people who are not familiar with us, think of us as the Kansas Association of Family Farmers and Ranchers. Right? These are farm families who have made a decision to belong to Farm Bureau. Now, we are also connected at the hip with a for-profit financial services system. And so often when people hear the words Farm Bureau, they will think, oh, sure, Farm Bureau insurance. And that is a part of our system, but it is separate in the sense of it has two completely separate cultures. It has two completely separate objectives. This system exists to sell insurance policies, right? Our system exists to advocate for farmers and ranchers. And if you think about the first 100 years of the organization, and if you think about the first 100 years of Kansas, they mirror each other pretty well, right? Kansas evolved over the years. We started as an agrarian state. As population shifted, that shifted a little bit more. Where we find ourselves now in our 100th year is in the middle of some really significant change. I'll mention just a couple of statistics. In the year 2000, so 19 years ago, an entire generation ago, the census, we count noses every 10 years, federal census. The 2000 census in Kansas was the first time in the history of the state that urban and suburban Kansans outnumbered rural Kansans. And we're not going back, right? That's a trend line that will continue to go up with respect to the growth of urban and suburban. And so what that has meant for the 80 years, or the 91 years, however, I'm very lousy at math, for the first 100 years, roughly, we advocated for family farmers and ranchers from a position of strength, right? We advocated from a position of influence, from a position of clout, from a position of having political power because you had numbers. Now that's changing. And the challenge that we face in our system is what's that mean? A, what's that mean for consumers? And B, what does that mean for our own system? And so one of the things that I'm involved with at the system, at the organization, we're based in Manhattan, is I'm helping to staff a 2-year strategic planning effort for the entire organization. And it's taking a deep dive into these sorts of questions, right? We want to be able to make sure that we have a family farmer rancher advocacy organization that exists to advocate, to educate, to provide service to these members that is reflective of what they look like in the 21st century. And that's a challenge, because the biggest, we call it the pig in the python, right? The biggest component of our membership is 65 plus. That mirrors the demographics of rural Kansas. And if you think about that and what that's going to look like a generation from now, it's significantly different, right? So the numbers, the sheer numbers themselves of people who live in rural Kansas and who consider themselves family farmers and ranchers will do a precipitous decline. And so one of the messages that we communicate in this strategic planning work is the future of Kansas agriculture is larger farms and fewer farmers. And that is really hard for some of our folks to get their head and their heart around, because they're used to what they would consider in their generation a traditional family farm, 2,500, 3,000 acres maybe. But farms are getting larger and farmers are becoming fewer. And so that's just one of the challenges we're wrestling with. But the idea is to repurpose a 100-year-old tradition-driven, hidebound farm organization so that it is reflective of those who will make a purposeful, conscious decision to do this work and to live this life in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. And give us just a snapshot of Kansas's agricultural economy right now. What is the role right now that agriculture plays in Kansas's economy?
It is still the biggest driver and economic driver. It accounts for about a half of the state's economic output. It is much more than family farms and ranches, right? There are a number of components. You touched on these, some of them in your opening, right? There are traditional family farms and ranches which produce raw commodities, right? They will grow crops or they will produce livestock. They grow raw commodities, and when they market that crop or that animal, they're done and they'll go back and raise the next one, right? But what happens to that commodity after the farmer or rancher is done with it, then there's a component of food processing, right? And there are a number of systems in Kansas related to food processing that take the raw commodity and turn it into food, right? And there's a number of those in Kansas for logical reasons, right? We're proximity to the commodities. And so that's a huge component of the agricultural economy. And then once it's processed, it gets delivered to grocery stores or to restaurants and that sort of thing. So there's a significant component of the production economy that has so much more to do than just traditional family farmers and ranchers. And then there's another layer that goes into this conversation with respect to economic output, and that is all of the systems that are ancillary to each of those earlier components. And let's just talk about family farmers and ranchers, right? They'll buy a tractor, they'll buy a combine. That means that there'll be an implement dealer in the neighboring community that will base his or her income on that farmer's income. All kinds of services for the farm with respect to equipment, with respect to crop consulting. There are a host of ancillary services that are built into the Kansas agricultural economy that are dependent upon the success of family farmers and ranchers.
Yeah. And what are the main sectors? You touched on a couple of them. What are the main sectors of that economy right now in Kansas?
It's none of them will shock you, right? We grow cattle, we grow wheat, we grow corn, we grow soybeans, we grow grain sorghum. Another word for grain sorghum is milo. We increasingly along the southern tier of counties in Kansas, we grow cotton, and all of these are based on the notion that we have a climate and a geography that is conducive to the production and the growth of these crops. That's why they were here to begin with, right? Especially if you think about a wheat crop in Kansas. We plant wheat in the fall, we harvest it in the summer. We grow hard red winter wheat in Kansas. That means that it lies dormant in the winter underneath what is traditionally snow, right? That provides moisture for that crop. And as a result, because of that climate, because of those conditions, because we tend to be flat, generally speaking, it's a great place to grow wheat, right? And the same applies for many of those other commodities, and the same thing applies clearly with cattle production. We're first in the nation in cattle production, not only actually raising cattle, but actually also producing them and processing them. I think we're first in grain sorghum. We take turns with North Dakota on wheat. It just depends on their climate and what conditions they're involved with. But we trade off between North Dakota between 1 and 2. There is a growing dairy industry in Kansas, especially in the southwest part of the state, and and that goes to the food processing component. These are not your traditional mom and pop Wisconsin, Minnesota dairy farms. These are large-scale, economies of scale operation with thousands of dairy cattle, and that is the economic model of that sort of food production. And so we've got more of those in Kansas than we had in the past.
Mm-hmm. And so what is the role of exporting in the business model of today's farmers and ranchers in Kansas?
Exporting is the ball game. The financial health of family farmers and ranchers is dependent upon the ability to sell their product, right? In Kansas or in the United States, we produce significantly more agricultural products than we can consume in this country. And so logic and common sense tells you that means we need to be able to sell these products overseas to other countries. Because we're good at it, because we have proven over 100 years that we can produce these commodities at pretty significant quantities, pretty significant levels, the demand for that external market just continues to rise. 95% of the planet's consumers live outside the United States, right? So people who need to eat 3 meals a day, we need to be able to feed them, and we have the ability, we have proven that we can outproduce any other agricultural producing country on the planet. But for us, for family farmers and ranchers to be successful, right, for small communities to continue to thrive, for farm organizations to continue to be able to repurpose themselves so that they can be viable, we are dependent upon trade.
So I want to talk now about the Trump administration's trade policies and how those have affected farmers. And one of the things that we've always tried to do throughout the discussion group is really sort of define terms before we start using them. And so for today's, I just want to offer sort of a shorthand definition, because if you open a newspaper or go online and look at a newspaper, I guess not many people are opening newspapers these days, but if you're online looking at a newspaper, you'll see a lot of talk about the Trump administration's trade war and the trade war with China or another country. So today I just want to offer the definition of that when we're talking about, what we're talking about is the Trump administration's decision to impose tariffs on a host of goods that we import from other countries. Steel, aluminum, solar panels, washing machines, and that in turn, many of these countries have started imposing tariffs on a host of things that the U.S. exports. And included in this would be items like soybeans, sorghum, and other things like that that are a staple of Kansas agriculture. So as we dive into that, I just wanted us to all have that kind of a baseline definition for what we say when we're talking about it. So how has the administration's trade policies, especially relating to China, affected Kansas's agricultural economy?
Let's start. I don't want to sound like a lawyer, but let's start by stipulating that all of the global exporters of agricultural products before the trade war felt that China was a bad actor. Mm-hmm. Right? There was general consensus that China and their government were not living up to the rules that the other countries had developed together as part of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which for the sake of this conversation, I guess you'd call the regulator or the COP or the entity that helps provide structure for that. So that's where that conversation started. And so if you think about what China has done, right, the intellectual property rights, cyber theft, they have illegal internal domestic subsidies for their farm products that they have done. And we have won some, the United States has won some of those battles in the WTO. So the WTO has its role. And in fact, U.S. has won 91% of our cases against China. So there's plenty of evidence that exists that China hasn't been playing by the rules. So I guess that's where you start. And then if you listen to the president's rhetoric, if you listen to what he said when he was a candidate for the office in 2016, and if you listen to what he has said since, you get the sense, many of us in agriculture advocacy get the sense that his frame of reference was manufacturing, right? It was Rust Belt states in the United States that he was talking to. He felt strongly, clearly feels strongly, that American manufacturers were at a competitive disadvantage based on China's not playing by the rules. And so those of us involved in agriculture advocacy who are, and I'm a mile wide and an inch deep. I don't claim to be as fluent on trade as many of my colleagues and friends in the business are, but I think we all knew enough to know, because of the global dynamics of trade and how much farmers and ranchers are dependent upon exports, that this could become problematic. Because it doesn't, all of us recognize that if there is some sort of a sanction placed on China, then they will retaliate. Right? That is the notion, that is the foundation of a war, a trade war, and they will retaliate in such a fashion that aims to impact negatively the other partner. And so agriculture was going to be on that list from the top. And I still can remember about a year ago, February of 18, I think, when he announced his first tariffs, when I read it in the news that morning, and I just got a sinking feeling in my gut. Here we go, right? And so I called a colleague who manages our lobbying efforts in Washington, and I wanted to check some assumptions, right? I said, am I right in assuming that agriculture could very well be impacted? And he confirmed those assumptions. And so then we all started feeling bad, right? And so we suspected it was coming, right? And so now that it is here, doesn't make it any easier. But let me mention just a couple of, let me drop some names. There are some Kansas connections at a pretty high level involved in these negotiations, especially as they relate to agriculture. Robert Lighthizer is the U.S. Trade Representative. He used to work for Senator Dole, right? We're at the Dole Institute. And so he is recognized by many people in this environment as a brilliant negotiator. And so we hope that's true. We hope that's true. Working for him is a guy named Greg Dowd. And Greg is a Kansas farm kid from Mankato. He's from Jewell County. He's a Facebook friend of mine. He is in charge of the USTR's agricultural sector. So he's the one going to bat for family farmers and ranchers across the nation in these efforts. And so we have conversations with them clearly, and we get the sense that we're glass half full kind of people, right? We are hopeful that this will lead to good things. We are hopeful that the president's actions against China will put China in a position to act differently. And if they do, then ag exports will open up again. There's all kinds of room for all kinds of new exporting to China, but it's dependent upon these negotiations and where they go, and we're right in the middle of that stuff now.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned they're starting again next week.
Yeah, you kind of were going there already to my next question. Yeah. A lot of this is what you hear described as what is happening right now mostly by supporters of the Trump administration and their policies in trade. It's been described as a short-term pain with the hope of a longer-term gain in the form of a, quote, better deal with China. How well does that description apply to how the Kansas Farm Bureau members are looking at what's happening?
It's a couple of things. Uncertainty with respect to their bottom line and with respect to their business plan is sort of a given in family farming and ranching. There is so much that is out of their direct control. They describe themselves as price takers, not price makers, right? The prices they get for their crops and their livestock, they have no direct control over. It's supply and demand in the market that sets that price. So that's part of it. They're dealing with climate. They're dealing with weather changes. I mean, I'm sure you've seen what's happened in Nebraska. It's heartbreaking when you look at what has happened in Nebraska and some of the cattle that have died as a result of weather-related problems in Nebraska. So changes our guys are thinking about. This is spring, right? Today's the first day of spring. In spring, we will plant fall crops. We will plant soybeans, corn, and grain sorghum. And so I don't think we are far enough along, and I hope we don't, not to say that we want the trade war to last long, we don't, but right now we're early enough in it that it's really not causing them significant financial difficulty. The trend lines don't look good. There were 35 farm bankruptcies last year. That was, I think, second or third in the nation. So there are signs that are not positive, but right now we're in pretty good shape. If it goes on further, if there are additional tariffs or sanctions, and if China, if it gets worse, it's going to get worse on the farm and in rural Kansas too.
Yeah, and what are, if any, and maybe we're not at this point yet, but are there, because I won't always talk about this in sort of that this has a real impact on the real lives of real people in Kansas. What, if any, are some of the changes that Kansas farmers have had to make or are contemplating making to what would be their normal business practice because of the uncertainty, because of the dynamics going on right now?
Yeah, they're watching this stuff very closely, right? They are following these moves by our government and other governments very closely. And so, again, they'll make the planting decisions here pretty quick about the fall crops that they need to plant here in the spring. And they'll make that based on their best judgment, based on their own experience, based on what they see, what their consultants tell them is the best way to go, where the price is, what they think the price is going to be in the fall when they want to harvest and sell. So that's part of it. I will say that, and it has probably tangentially, partially to do with this conversation with respect to trade, but conversations that farmers have with their bankers is getting more difficult. Mm-hmm. Banks are bottom line driven operations, right? Banks need to turn a profit. Their product happens to be money, but they exist to make money. And think about the 100 years ago, right? Think about 100 years of tradition in Kansas, and actually the whole middle of the country. Family farmers and ranchers would get operating loans from their banker over bacon and eggs at the coffee shop in the morning, right? That was the way things got done. Well, there's a whole new generation of bankers, right? The bankers are getting older too, right? So that dynamic is changing, and what you're finding, and I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong, I'm describing what it is. What you're finding is that you have a younger generation of bankers that is more bottom line driven, and they will take a closer look at some of those loans and may not be as quick to loan money when there is an uncertain guarantee at the end. Mm-hmm. And so those pressures, I think, existed before the trade war, but the trade war doesn't make them any easier.
So I think we've seen some tightening, the beginning of some tightening of some credit markets in the private sector. And all of this is taking place in an election year, right? And without being political, I don't think we could ignore that there's a political component to this. And so we're about to head full steam into a presidential cycle. And here in Kansas, interestingly, we're going to have potentially a very competitive election for the U.S. Senate seat being vacated by Senator Pat Roberts, the chairman of the Senate Agricultural Committee and a longtime real champion of Kansas agriculture. And so that has a potential to have a real interesting dynamic here. There was a January 15th article in the Washington Post, and it said farmers have remained among the most stalwart of President Trump's supporters. But the previous day, the president of the American Farm Bureau Federation, he said something at their annual convention that really struck me as really interesting. He said, "The U.S.-China trade war is going to be a long one, and we keep delivering the message, we're with you, Mr. President." But then he added this really interesting caveat. He went on to say that the runway of our patience will be determined by the financial situation of our farms. We went into the battle very weak. So do you think farmers will, by and large, stick with the president through 2020? Or what do you see when you're having these conversations? What do you hear?
I can't put it any more eloquently than Zippy Duvall did. Zippy Duvall is the president of the American Farm Bureau Federation. Kansas Farm Bureau is one of 50 states that belong to that. AFBF is the national lobbying arm of Farm Bureau. Zippy's a farmer from Georgia. The Secretary of Agriculture is named Sonny Perdue. He's from Georgia. So we have Sonny from Georgia and Zippy from Georgia. I don't know what it is about Georgians and their unique names.
And our ag champions are Bob and
Right,
Pat. We really need to spice it up.
Jerry, I know, exactly. But you nailed it. I mean, what he said is, we're with you for now, because in a broad general sense, family farmers and ranchers tend to be conservative, right? It's their nature. And they tend to like less regulation. They tend to support Republicans. And so it made sense that they would support the Republican candidate for president in 2016. But when Mr. Duvall added that caveat, he was simply, well, he's doing two things. He's a politician, so he's covering his hindquarters with respect to his own constituency. But he was also very eloquently communicating to his constituency, family farmers and ranchers, and we hope to the White House that the patience has a shelf life, right? This is a finite commodity, and at some point, if things, I can't remember his words, but it was when we start to feel it financially, that's when things might change.
Yeah, I thought the runway analogy was just a really interesting, the runway of our patience being determined by the financial situation. So how much runway do you think is left?
Well, I mentioned earlier, I think we're early enough that there haven't been significant, large-scale agricultural losses, right? The trend lines aren't going the right way, right? But we're used to up and down trend lines, right? That's the nature of the business. It's when the trend lines start to nosedive, and when you start to see, well, we can talk about what people want to, what to watch out for. But I think, with respect to answering your question, I think they'll stay with him, right? Because I think at the end of the day, they want China to play nice with everybody else on the planet. And if that strategy works, right? If the administration's goal of getting China to play nice with everybody else on the planet, if that works, then we'll be selling a lot of agricultural products to China. Now that's a huge gamble, because he is placing his stock in his ability, or the administration's ability, to make an argument to a Chinese system of government that has no incentive to change, right? There is no incentive for them to do what we want them to do. And so that's where it takes people with skill, right? And that's where it doesn't take me long to get lost in the nuances of tradecraft. But if we can pull that off, if the outcome of this effort is China is now going to play nice in the global community with respect to all these concerns that other countries have raised, then that's good. And I think farmers are optimistic by nature, so that's where they're hanging their hat right now. But again, Zippy said it best, short runway.
Yeah. So we've got a room full of political junkies here, and we're all going to be watching this election with bated breath. So help us out. Kind of talk to us about what should we watch in terms of politics and policy? What might be some canary in the coal mines for us to keep our eye on as we watch where this is all going over the next couple months? Or really up and through 2020?
Sure. Two or three things. I think in the short term, watch for the congressional vote on USMCA, right? The United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, the NAFTA 2.0. Watch the congressional vote on USMCA. That was put in place to correct what the administration saw as deficiencies in NAFTA. Okay, will that be a vote on the merits of the package, or will that be a political vote from House Democrats who want to embarrass the president, or will they line up politically, or will that be a vote on its merits? That'll be difficult, right? I can't remember the last time we had a vote in Congress that wasn't that way, right? So watch that one. Watch to see if we engage meaningfully in bilateral conversations with Japan and with the EU, and to a certain extent with the United Kingdom after they figure out their Brexit stuff, right? The whole premise of Trump pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership when he first took office was his belief that he could cut better bilateral deals than what the multilateral status quo was providing. And so watch that, right? If we can start meaningful conversations and have a meaningful bilateral deal with Japan and with the EU, watch for those things. That'll take a while, right? But watch and see how that progresses. Watch what we say. Watch what mainstream farm organizations say, right? Follow Zippy Duvall. He is going to be the most quoted farm leader in this country. And he represents the most mainstream family farmer rancher system in the nation. Watch what he says. Watch what the leader of NCBA, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, says. Watch what these guys and women say, because they, and then sort of a yin-yang with that, watch what farm state senators and representatives say, because oftentimes what will happen is the farm groups will stake out some ground and the farm state politicians will follow, or vice versa. The farm state politicians will stake out some ground and the farm organizations will follow. I think in a broad general sense, those two groups are on the same page, but watch what they say. I think that will give you a sense of the length of the runway, that will give you a sense of which general direction this is going to go.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's turn it over to the audience for some questions. We're going to have a microphone. We've got Alex and Haley. Please wait till the microphone gets to you. And any questions from our audience for Mike?
Thank you. Very interesting. My question, you mentioned what's going on in Nebraska right now, and some in Missouri and Iowa, but there's also one that you don't read much about here. And I guess my question is, the states that still have land that they can grow the product that needs to be grown to feed the world, and I think it's either North Carolina or South Carolina, with those hurricanes and that water coming in, and it's taking acres and acres and acres of farmland that they normally, and some of them are saying, you know, they will never ever be able to farm again because it's completely ruining the ground. And so I guess my question is, the states that still do have ground that they can farm,
right?
You know, how are they looking at that, I guess?
No, great question. And I'll address it a couple of ways. Climate change is legit, right? And all you have to, you just mentioned several examples, right? It is here to stay. And think about the nature of family farmers and ranchers. Think about the pig and the python and the 65 plus and the way those people tend to think, right? We are slow to that realization. And so we're not on the cutting edge of that debate, right? But unaddressed, it will cause very specific isolated problems, and you mentioned some of them, right? Hurricanes will take away land that'll take years for it to recover. Here's the bright side. We have proven in this country that we can produce more crops and more livestock on the same amount of land, and that's as a result of technology. Not only electronic technology. If you've ever been in a tractor or a combine lately, they drive themselves, right? Technology has not escaped the agriculture industry. So technology allows farmers to do more with less, and biological technology, right? Genetically modified organisms, GMOs, hybrid crops, all of these things will allow more production to occur, which will allow more food to be produced. But all of that, still going to have to sell it regardless of how it's produced. That answer your question? Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the implications of Pat Roberts' retirement and whether the Bureau has a favorite
Great question.
to run?
Yeah, I mean, think about this. Think about Kansas, and think about Kansas senators, right? Think about the first 100 years of Farm Bureau. We had numbers, and so it was easy for agriculture, rural interests, to elect and support politicians who felt similarly, okay? Pat Roberts is the latest in the long line. In this building, there is an entire wall of awards that Senator Bob Dole received. Many of them are from farm groups and from farm organizations. And so that traditionally has been sort of the political model in Kansas. Pat Roberts is probably the last of the line, right? Jerry Moran is there too, and he's up again in 2022. He is a wonderful, tremendous supporter of agriculture. And if you've never had a chance to listen to Senator Moran, I would encourage you to, because he's got a great story about culture and what it means to be a family farmer and rancher. But to answer your question, we're a farm organization. We have a political advocacy component. We work to elect people, right? There will be, I think there's already been 6 or 8 Republicans who have indicated they wanted to run. I'm sure there'll be some Democrats as well. So we've got a system in place within our organization that will help identify which candidate we support. And that conversation has already started.
So I'm interested in healthcare expansion, and not only the Farm Bureau's perspective on that, but also the implications of that for rural Kansas. Seeing that right now in the State House, they're currently arguing and amending and moving forward with Medicaid expansion.
Yeah, Medicaid expansion, I think, has become probably the biggest political football in Kansas politics. We as an organization don't have a position on it. There are some who think we should. There are some who tie it directly to the health of rural hospitals. And we have a system, a policy development system that is member-driven, right? And so for us to take a position on that would require our membership to get engaged to the point where they recognize it as a threat. That hasn't happened yet. I think what we've been pushing this year in Topeka is and we're encountering some roadblocks, is we've got an idea that will allow us, with our partners on the for-profit side of our organization, to create a health insurance product for family farmers and ranchers that would serve a lot of people that are not currently being served, but it has gotten muddied up in a bigger conversation about Medicaid expansion. It has gotten muddied up into a bigger conversation about availability. And so it's not over yet. Nothing's over in the legislature until sine die. But it was created, and that proposal was floated because the need exists in rural Kansas for health care coverage for family farmers and ranchers. The traditional model, and this is changing, but the traditional model for 100 years, or at least the last 50 years, was the husband was the farmer, the wife was either a school teacher or a nurse in town and got their health insurance through that system that covered the family. They had 2 or 3 kids, and that tended to be the way it worked. Well, as those systems change, and as those benefits no longer are what they used to be, it's creating a whole component of human beings that are not covered. So we could probably talk about that all day.
Kind of as a follow-up to that question on the subject of healthcare, in regards to the bill that's currently working its way through the State House, one of the features that has come under fire is the ability for this bill to be exempted from certain regulations, including those guaranteeing coverage for those with pre-existing conditions. Given the fact that the farmers, as you mentioned, demographically are overwhelmingly, increasingly over 65, and those are often those with pre-existing conditions, what is the Bureau's stance on that and guaranteeing that everyone will have access to affordable health care, even if they have pre-existing conditions.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that the proposal that, and bear in mind, what we seek in the legislature is basically approval, statutory approval, to create sort of a one-off product, right, that would not necessarily be regulated. But we recognize that the reality of what that needs to look like in an environment where we work in politics, right? So what we've done is we have sat down with the insurance commissioner and said, here's what we're doing. This is the audience that we seek to serve. This is the product that would help cover these people that are not currently covered and are priced out of the market through ACA or through other private healthcare providers. And so from that perspective, it's a brand new deal, right, in Kansas. This thing's been in, something like this has been in place for 70 years in Tennessee. Iowa is starting this conversation. There are a number of other states that are starting this conversation. So I think what you're seeing is reaction to something that's new and people don't really understand yet. And that's natural. That happens a lot in the political environment in Topeka.
Do you know the amount of the government subsidies that came to Kansas as a result of the tariff, the trade war?
Yeah, I don't know the number, but you're talking about, I think they called it market facilitation payments.
Well, I think the Trump administration tried to ease the pain of farmers, and I don't know, on a per farmer basis or.
Correct.
So just to back up and make sure everybody's on the same page, what the question is about the market facilitation program. So this was a $12 billion program put forward by the Trump administration, whereby farmers who were affected by the tariffs could apply for subsidies from the government to try to make up some of the difference in a loss that they incurred because of the tariffs. And so it's a $12 billion program. I think we've allocated about, I think it was $9.8 billion of that $12 billion the last time I looked at it. But I'm not sure about Kansas specific.
Yeah, I don't know the number, but I will say I'm glad you mentioned that because I think it's worth me talking about a little bit. Generally speaking, when that occurred, our folks said, we want trade, not aid, right? We don't want government providing. We don't want government to make us whole unless government is doing what we hope and expect they will do, and that is cutting deals with other foreign governments to allow us to sell those products.
I get you'd rather have trade, but I'm trying to get what the number is.
I don't know.
How much came to Kansas? Is that also then reflective that you were saying that the financial well-being of Kansas farmers is still okay, they're not feeling terrible pain?
That's part of it, correct. Absent that, it would be more difficult, there's no doubt.
Okay. I'll pass.
Could you talk a little bit more about USMCA and how the changes from NAFTA affect Kansas, positive or negative, and if the Farm Bureau has a specific stance on supporting that?
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to give you the specifics of what's going to be different from NAFTA with USMCA, but I can tell you just from a structure and process perspective, right? USMCA will allow for trade with Mexico and Canada. We need that. We need a trade agreement with Mexico and Canada to sell our products, right? NAFTA allowed for that. We're not going to argue whether NAFTA was good and USMCA is better. We will say that NAFTA is no longer there and that USMCA has the possibility to be there. And so when I asked you to, when the question was of what should you watch for, when you want to telegraph a move for the future, watch the way Congress votes on that. Will they treat it politically or will they vote it on its merits? Because if you vote it on its merits, you are putting in place a trade agreement with two countries that we sell product to.
You touched kind of briefly on the climate change issues with the agriculture industry and how climate change is kind of disproportionately affecting farmers.
Yep.
So where does the Farm Bureau stand on kind of solutions to this issue within maybe agriculture and then maybe like broader nationally?
Yeah, probably can't help you much there. We are, clearly, there is no group of individuals on the planet that are more impacted by weather than farmers and ranchers, right? They can tell you. You get next to one of these guys that's been doing this for a while, or women, and there are a lot of women that are farming in Kansas, and they can tell you exactly by looking at the sky what's going to happen, right? And they're not sticking their heads in the sand. They see what is happening, right? They see what's happening one state to the north, right, as a result of people that are just like them doing the same exact kind of work, and then it hits them right here, right? Then that could be me, right? And that's weather impacted, right? That is climate change impacted. And so all you got to do is open your eyes and look around and get a sense of that.
Got time for a couple more. We got one in the back.
I hear a lot about family farming.
Yep.
But I haven't heard you say anything about corporate farms and where they fit into your constituency and what their influence is.
Sure. I think there's an enormous misconception when people hear the word corporate farms. There are most family farms are incorporated, right? Most family farms are LLCs from a business perspective, right? There are professional agribusinesses, right, that have products that they sell to farmers. You think of the food production stuff we talked about earlier. McCarty Dairy in southwest Kansas is a corporation, right, that produces milk. But in terms of family farmers and ranchers, the traditional model, the traditional thing that people think of in Kansas is sort of that model I described before. It's a family, and most of our members are multi-generation, right? And it used to be one family farm in Kansas could support a couple of generations of a family, and that is becoming increasingly hard. And so I don't think it's all in how you describe it, but many family farms are incorporated, so in that sense they are a corporate farm. But is there something else that I'm missing?
I guess I ran into a couple of people who invested in farming.
Yeah.
They were living in a city and they had no contact, but there was a large group and they owned this farm, and it was, it's not like a local family managing a farm, making decisions that are best.
Here's a good example, close to home here. Think about what Tyson tried to do in Tonganoxie. Right? Tyson is a chicken provider, and they're a company that processes chicken, and they're based in the Mid-South, and they wanted to move to Tonganoxie, Kansas. They wanted to expand here, and they wanted to contract with family farmers and ranchers to put chicken growing houses on their farm, and then those animals would be fed into the processing plant, and they'd get packaged up and sent off to the supermarkets, right? That's their business model that has proven successful for them all over the Mid-South. This is the first time they'd come to the middle of the country, right? When they got to Tonganoxie, we got the impression, because we were involved in that, right? Because we had a lot of members who were interested in contracting with Tyson because it's a revenue stream for them. But we got the impression in that conversation that when Tyson looked at the map, they thought, Tonganoxie, rural Kansas, right? Tonganoxie is a suburb of Johnson County. If you've been in Tonganoxie, Kansas, the culture is not what you'll find in Ness City, right? It's just not. And that goes to the conversation about the change that's underway in Kansas as a result of these population shifts. So Tyson learned a really hard lesson, right? And I won't be surprised if they don't come back. Right? It was a difficult lesson for them to learn. Now, I will argue, as an agricultural advocate, that had they come in ahead of time and conditioned the environment for that conversation, built relationships with community leaders, helped the community understand what's at stake, they might have had a different outcome. Maybe not. Tonganoxie think this way, and they may have wanted nothing to do with Tyson. But that's maybe a good example of just the way that things are changing in Kansas and how rapidly they're changing. And our folks, family farmers and ranchers, they struggle with that change.
All right, we'll do one more and then we'll wrap up. Any last questions for Mike?
I just was curious, kind of in a kind of similar vein, over the last couple decades, we've seen a larger consolidation of farming by not necessarily, because as you accurately described, many are incorporated, but by corporations that own vast swaths of land that could not be maintained by a single family or a community family. It's a kind of business enterprise. How has that impacted the relationships with family farms to the agricultural scene, and where is the future in that?
Well, it's a great question, and it gets to this rapid culture change, right? The thing that we worry about most in Farm Bureau is that as farms get larger, that implies that you're going to lose them, right? Because when farms get larger, they expand and they take somebody else's ground, right? That's the business model. Land sales happen every day in this state. And as that happens, what happens to those folks there, right? If you go to western Kansas, if you go to some of the least populated counties of of our state, you'll find 20,000 or 30,000 acre farms out there. Those are significantly large operations that are on the planet to make money. And make no mistake, farming and ranching is a business. People are in this to earn a living, right? There happens to be an entire 100-year overlay culture of emotion that has driven it, but they're doing it so that they can feed their kids and they can put money in the offering plate on Sunday and pay the property taxes for the local school, right? So it is a business. It happens to be wrapped up in culture, right? And then we start talking about how you message this and how you communicate that to people who live in Johnson County and Sedgwick County who don't live on a farm, right? And there's probably no better example of how that impacts us than when you look at the Kansas legislature, right? 125 members of the Kansas House, half of them are from 2 counties, right? So if we are not building relationships with representatives from Johnson and Sedgwick County, shame on us, right? Because that's where people live, that's where they're going to get represented. It's a relatively easy conversation to have in Kansas today, because there's generally some sort of a family connection you can make with pretty much anyone in the state related to farming and ranching. They're not that far removed from it. That's going to get harder and harder as the days and months and years and decades progress, because we're going to get further and further removed from it. And that's the kind of work I do every day. I love doing it because I'm a Kansan. I was born here. I'm going to die here. These are some of the, and not that farmers and ranchers are better than anybody else, but they are the cliche. They are salt of the earth, love your neighbor, do anything they can for you, right? And they struggle with change. And so from my perspective, as a member of their professional staff and their farm organization, I love the work that I do because it's wonderful people that we're trying to do this for. I could keep talking about this forever. Sorry.
I'm going to start crying,
Yeah,
so
no,
let's.
but-
So that's a good point, good place for us to end. But I hope you'll join us for our next 2 sessions. We're going to be back next week talking about the messaging and communications aspect of all of this and how this gets talked about, especially as we start going headlong into the 2020 election cycle. And then we'll wrap up on April 3rd talking about how we enforce these agreements once they're entered into. So thank you so much for coming. And could we give Mike a warm round of applause for a really... Thank you, and see you next week.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.